Okay, hello. This is the second part of session 4, delayed by a week, but in the interim, I've been able to extend your project deadline. Hopefully, you're already working on it. Many of you have been in touch with me. So, this is a final kind of case study. The next time you see me, hopefully, we're talking about some of your ideas that have been inspired by case studies and effectively. If you're able to get any material to me by Friday, I can include it over the weekend in some review, but the actual final deadline will be the following Monday. Anyway, that's all written online. So let's just, with no further ado, start with today's slides. So, and actually, there's always this little moment of trying to figure out getting the slides started. Move the cursor. Okay, here we go. So today the focus will be on the National Public Housing Museum, which is a place that I worked with in a few different capacities, which are actually interesting. What I'd like to focus on is this idea of the social impact of a museum or a cultural organization, not, and I know I'm reiterating and repeating myself, but not only looking at the outcomes through a program or an exhibit, but actually thinking about the organization itself and how one constitutes a cultural institution, how it's staffed, how it's organized, how it's led, and how that relates to power, leadership, relation to stakeholders, to funding. And so this case study is easy for me to talk about because I worked with it for many years. One of the readings, this slide is drawing from a quote from Catherine Fennell. I know her as Cassie. She's a professor now at Columbia University. Was able to engage her research, and this is a sort of an extended aside, but I think it's interesting, and it doesn't always happen, that those inside an organization or institution reach out to those who might be critics or scholars of said organization. And I think one thing that I liked is to sort of incorporate a critical framework and not, I guess you could say when you're in an organization, the temptation is to drink the Kool-Aid and to become a kind of, this organization is the best thing ever. Particularly on a leadership front, sometimes lower down at a staff, one can be critical but feel not heard. So it was important for me joining this organization to reach out to someone like Cassie, who had written, and as you read the article, it's mostly pretty laudatory and complimentary, but it's also critical, and it's thinking about this question of sympathy and what is the power or the potential, won't call it weakness, but the limits of power for a cultural institution to change a conversation about something as complex as public housing. So anyway, in this quote, sort of summarizes like who she's focusing on, and I found it interesting. I think she's understating the case that not only do former and current public housing residents support the museum, but they're actually really the reason for the origins of the museum. But in this particular case, and she's an anthropologist, so I found it also interesting that she's doing a kind of anthropology of power or an anthropology of leadership. So she's looking at the, quote, mostly middle-aged, white, well-educated, and financially secure professionals with commitments to progressive social and political causes and focusing on them for two reasons. And I guess the first one I underscored here, that the museum's long-term viability depended on appealing to people with no biographical connections to public housing. So I think what's interesting, and actually I think a few of the projects touch on this a bit, is what is the relationship between elites or those with power, with funders, and the sort of historical underpinnings of cultural institutions with elites and the ability to raise capital and to secure parcels of property, and others who might feel outside, or not just feel, but who may exist outside of power, whether that is in a big city, minority populations, or currently you could look at just our whole political system, and those that are in rural areas or working class may be existing outside of access to power Um, and so anyway, I think it's interesting to consider the Public Housing Museum as a case study in an imperfect attempt to balance and to align interests. And also then I think the interest of the Public Housing Museum, as this points out to, is to say that there are poor people who lived in public housing who were on the short end of political decisions, rallied to push back against those decisions, gained allies who were progressives to work with them, and then together they needed to expand the circle of attention and interest in their cause in order to be successful. And how did they do so? So this requires a little bit of a backstory just so you understand how it came to be that there was a need for public housing. And as you can see from these images, there are images of demolition. In Chicago, public housing, like in the rest of the country, has its origins in the New Deal and in the time of FDR, responding to a crisis, an economic crisis, and with progressive thinkers at the time, people in Chicago like Jane Addams, were really looking at the problem of the depression as it existed on the ground as what they called, and I'm quoting, a market failure. So there was a specific critique of real estate, of landlords, and in the 30s, a large part of Chicago, now this is an image actually from the 90s, but the same area of town was sort of designated for slum clearance. So there were older buildings, tenement buildings that were torn down in the 30s with the backing of a local settlement house and progressive leader, Jane Addams, and with the direct backing of the federal government led by, in this case, the Department of Interior's Secretary Harold Ickes, and they created a demonstration project called the Jane Addams Homes, named after Jane Addams, who had died by the time it was complete and opened to residents in 1937. And at any rate, that became part of the first wave of public housing. So most all public housing in the United States in any city from New York to Arizona to Louisville, Kentucky to Hawaii or San Diego, those projects opened on or about 1937, 1938. Fast forwarding to these images, by the time of the 80s and 90s, and certainly actually beginning in the 70s, public housing as this experiment had come under hard times and was really being revisited as a problem and not a solution to social ills. So when these buildings opened, they were actually largely populated by European immigrants in Chicago and other cities. When African Americans were living in public housing in those early days, they were segregated developments that African Americans actually had to rally to get access to and to get built because it wasn't really intended for them. By the 70s, 80s, and 90s, if you say the word public housings and the word projects, had a very different connotation. It's interesting to note that the notion that they are projects is because they were experiment, they were demonstrations, they were projects growing out of European traditions of modernism and architecture and the highest kind of elite thinking with working class, and you'll see this in the literature, working class were considered, quote, the deserving poor. So there were very stringent regulations of which even poor people could live in public housing by race, by class, by background. So anyway, by the 70s, 80s, and 90s, we were far away from that. Projects connotes African American life, as does public housing. They were highly segregated. They were also, which gets into the stories that the Public Housing Museum tries to tell through research, were highly disinvested. So large complexes like this, the geographically large territories that they covered, required a great deal of public investment and continued investment, and that just was not happening. So if you combine disinvestment in things like maintenance and things like policing and then sort of related investments in things like education or workforce development or transportation, these became very isolated compounds and they did not work. So by the Clinton administration, they were targeted for rethinking, reimagining, and under the a policy called Hope 6. Now, this is getting terribly in the weeds, but it's just important to give you some background. There was federal pots of money designated for experimental interventions which would replace public housing with mixed income communities built under a architectural philosophy of sort of more historic architecture. And Chicago was one of the first cities to take advantage of that pilot program and began to tear down its public housing, which you can see here. So very famously a Cabrini Green, less famously a Jane Addams, but equally this is Jane Addams. So you can see how close to the downtown and central core this project was, but perceptually, sort of anthropologically or socially, like one would sense before the public housing was torn down that this was very far from the kind of Chicago that business or a tourist would know. So while that was happening, residents of public housing were not sitting idly by. So this is a representation of the women who lead public housing communities, and all of them in different ways pushed back against this idea of rehabilitation through demolition. They responded in different ways with lawsuits, with protests, but one particular leader named DeVera Beverly of ABLA, which was the successor to the Jane Addams. So Jane Addams homes were first, and then other projects under the name of Brooks and Loomis and Abbott were built. So ABLA, ABLA, became this complex. And actually, this is showing the extent, a little bit of the extent of ABLA. It actually goes far to the south. But at any rate, so her response was multifold, but one important piece of it was that she wanted to save one building as a monument to say that we were here. And that's a paraphrase of some quotes from her in the media at the time. So this is the mid-90s. She was able to garner some support from progressives who did not think that the policy of Daley, the mayor at the time, or Clinton administration was wise or sound, and felt that that this monument could do some other things to tell a different story about public housing. So they succeeded to protect the building, which is shown here, with some of its neighbors. This is actually one of the original 1937 buildings. You can see that there was works of art which are now quite deteriorated. But you can get the sense of an experiment that had a lot of interest and support culturally and socially that had been neglected over time. So this building was selected to be saved through a federal action, a memorandum of agreement, that because of this history that I just told you, that these buildings were actually worthy of saving. However, because they were not useful as housing in the federal policy at the time, it was okay for the other set of buildings to be torn down and for one to be saved as this provisional museum. So, as the opening quote suggests, a building is saved, but to turn it into a museum, these grassroots women, residents of public housing, leaders as they were, did not have the capacity, the know-how to realize what it would be beyond, the monument that exists as a ruin, which was powerful in its own way, sitting on the corner of Chicago's Little Italy. So they had to create an organization, and through that so it's an interesting kind of organization. Many people tended to think, because of the word museum, that the museum came first and the outreach was a work of the museum. In a certain way, the women who created the idea to have a monument did outreach in communities of power, you could say, to create the organization that would bring their idea to fruition. So this is actually a picture of the board, and you can see me standing somewhere there. This is at not even a year I had worked there. But I actually started here in this picture. So this is 2013, when I'd been on staff for a year. This is 2011, when I joined this group to help them do a visioning of what would it actually be to turn this building into a museum. So this is actually a model which was created in 2010, so actually before this picture, related to this image here. So the process was a little complicated. You had a group of people. They found a gentleman, Rich Cahan. Actually, before Rich Cahan, so this history hasn't been written, which is why I say it's very anecdotal. But I think first they found a local activist that was doing local history for Taylor Street, and then he connected them to Rich Cahan, who was a program officer at a local philanthropy called the Dree House, and then he got his boss, Sonny Fisher, involved, and together they found some money to board up the building so that it would not fall into neglect. They reached out to other activists and advocates of public housing, like Roberta Feldman and Lisa Lee, who was running the Hull House Museum as a museum of conscience, and other folks, Brad Hunt, who is a famous scholar of public housing. And through those efforts, they created a board. They did a design competition, got Landon Bone Baker, who are very well known in Chicago for doing public interest design, which is design that really engages residents in the process of imagining and designing their communities. So together they created kind of a template, an image of the possibility of this ruin being a museum. When I showed up in 2011, what was lacking was really kind of a infrastructure of how all of this would come together in time and space with resources, what resources had available, how would they feasibly occupy this building to make it a museum, because it was clear that the challenge that the government had given them in this previous slide, this MOA basically said, we will save a building, you will be responsible for 100% of the maintenance, upkeep, design, and fundraising to turn this entire 40,000 square foot facility into a museum. Despite the connections in the kind of community of thought, of philanthropy, of academia, and what this picture also attests to is that residents of public housing remained leaders on the board. So DeVera was the founding chairman or chairwoman of the board. She was joined by prominent activists from other communities of public housing on the south side and the west side. Crystal Palmer from Horner, Francine Washington from the Stateway Gardens. Others like Mike, I'm forgetting Mike's last name now, but Mike had grown up in public housing, but Michael Rogers went on to become an architect for McDonald's. Anyway, I won't name everyone, but effectively there was a lot of hope and visioning, but there wasn't a plan. So we kind of were visioning a plan to incrementally occupy this building. And then a few years later, I joined the staff as a curator to sort of take these plans and make them happen. And a lot of what we were doing was balancing kind of the efforts to go through a political process to convince the powers that be that our staged and staggered plan to occupy this building bit by bit as we grew in capacity and grew in scale of in terms of our fundraising and our staffing, a kind of organic growth plan, a scaling plan. How would we convince the powers that be that that was reasonable? Because they really envisioned that, more a model of a museum that just opens all at once. But given the kind of museum we were, and to really stay connected with the grassroots, how do we do that all at once? How would we suddenly come up with $30 million? And how would even being able to have that much money create an imbalance of power? Whereas if we could raise, 3 or 6 in small bites, perhaps we could grow in such a way to maintain those connections to the grassroots. This is a bit of not an aside, but backing up a little bit, related to this kind of grand vision of the museum was this idea of modeling on other museums. So the Tenement Museum in New York was a real model, and the idea that, as in the Tenement Museum, you might be able to go back in the past and in each apartment visit a history. And there was work done before I arrived to begin to collect oral histories from a time at the beginning of the story when these projects were European immigrants, deserving poor. This is a Jewish family, the Medor family that lived there right when it opened in 1937, tracking the demographic change that happens over time. So this is a picture of a classroom group, and you can see European Americans and African Americans together from an Italian family that lived there when the neighborhood was changing. And then in the 70s, an African American family who lived there at a time that it was still a very hopeful place, where this was a family of a pastor, and his son would also become a religious figure and political leader, the Reverend Hatch in Chicago. But it tells sort of a kind of arc of reframing public housing, and if you read the article by Fennell, a lot of what she's talking about is this vision of reframing history in a way that maybe makes it, which is a true history, but also one that would be more palatable for this audience for whom we were trying to fundraise. But looking at the scale of this building, one of the challenges that I realized was that you could only do so much of that. It didn't seem feasible to have 40,000 square feet of apartment stories from Chicago. And so how do we accommodate some other things the museum needed to do? And how do we do that in a way that also could raise the money we needed and in the time frame we had? And at any point when I joined, actually, there was a sense that at any point, this museum could be torn down like the rest. And you can see, I'm just going to go back to this image. This is the museum here. All this vacant land was filled with buildings similar to it. And so they had been torn down. And this is actually a picture from a real estate developer's packet. So from a real estate point of view, this is prime territory. And this building is really in a way. So unless it's a proven concept to be a museum that's successful, from a real estate developer's point of view, it's an eyesore. So there was pressure to move faster than we had moved. Remember, this building was saved by decree in 1998. The buildings around it were torn down in 2002. I show up in 2011 to do a visioning. It's still, nothing's built, nothing's happening. In 2013, I joined the staff. And so then I'll just talk about a few things I did between 2013 and 2016, when I left for the job that I'm currently in, to address this kind of twofold idea of social impact. On the one hand, the impact on the ground, issues of public housing, issues of poverty, what do they tie into? And I'll go into some of those social, political, economic issues. But then on the back end, fundraising, staffing, a board, all the kind of invisible stuff. How did those things impact one another? The story we're kind of trying to tell to change society, how would the kind of organization we were creating relate to the story we're trying to tell? So just to back up, there's this story of, a family of a reverend, a family of a Jewish family, this Italian family. It's a lovely American story that we actually don't hear and needs to be told. But there were other issues behind this museum, and it frankly didn't seem realistic that, to build this, would it be a viable museum with the kind of audience that needed to sustain itself? But more to the point, would it really serve the purposes of the residents who had founded it? They had some other issues they wanted us to address. And those issues, this picture looks like a picture of public housing that comes to mind more so. This does not look like a picture of public housing, even though they are pictures of public housing. And that's a problem, that our picture of public housing is this. But what I found interesting is that, there's a sense of decay. There's a sense of a real kind of angsty kind of poverty, graffiti. One thinks of gangs. One thinks of all sorts of negative associations. And the residents wanted two things. One, to, on one hand, address the stigma, the stereotype, and the kind of projections onto what they would say are truths, but there's stories behind those truths that need to be heard, like, that gang members are responding to an economy where there are no jobs, and there are real restrictions even to running a business legitimately out of your apartment, and their creative responses, they are underground economies, if you want to frame them another way, that are tapping into markets that are who's doing these drugs are, suburbanites coming into the city. So for them, it's really unfair to point a finger at the public housing resident when you're talking about something like gangs or drugs. They would like to draw a larger circle and look at the social context that creates such conditions. But then at the same time, in telling these stories, they would ask us, well, actually, so what I just talked about, this reframing gang context, there's a Columbia University scholar, Sudhir Venkatesh, who's gotten somewhat famous through a very critical analysis that recontextualizes things like gangs and asks really powerful questions about, why society is to blame for some of the things that we point to poor residents for being to blame, but then also points out some of the hidden ingenuity and savvy of, say, people that get involved with gangs. But they would ask further, like, well, that's great what Sudhir's doing, but actually, we know that. Like, that expertise is our expertise. He comes around, a sociologist, or Cassie comes around, an anthropologist, and we tell them stuff, or we tell you tough stuff. We tell you stuff, or we could tell you stuff, Todd, who is, an African American, but an architect, and worked on all these big museums all over the world. So we tell all you people things that you have leverage and power and connections, and you make the money, and you command the stage. What about us? How does telling these stories help us in the short term? We know in the long term it changes the system, but how do we benefit? How do we connect? What are the jobs that we're going to get at such a museum? So these things really resonated with me. So part of what I tried to do, and I'm not going to probably go into this in as much detail as I could, but in thinking about, so this is this woman's photo. She joined our board. Annie is a photographer, and again, I get to know people so much by their first name. Annie Steubenfield is a photographer who took this amazing picture, lived in public housing, still lives in public housing, and her question is really apt. So part of, for me, what was important is to make sure that the opportunities we're creating to tell the story create opportunity to tell a different story about public housing that changes the system, that has a social impact. Also, behind the scenes, creates a position of leverage for Annie to be on the board, to be involved in decisions about what we curate, but also giving her opportunities to connect. So we had a few opportunities where she worked with a group of IIT students to create an exhibit of her work that was then shown in a Puerto Rican community and was a great form of outreach for us. And then in a different project, which is depicted here, she actually teaches senior residents photography. And we did a session where we looked at their photographs and her photographs and shared stories. And they basically became the curators of how, there's a whole wonderful backstory. This image is actually very deceptive. It's a poignant image where without any framing, it can look like a disturbing image. And I won't go into the story of that image, but without these women telling that story and being the curators of this, we wouldn't have that. And for me to sort of, as the curator, step back and say, I'm really the facilitator of this framing and this connection. It's not really for me to own this form of expertise. It's to give, through the museum, the community a place to be the expert. And then when we ask for these photos or ask Annie to take some new photos, there is a transaction that happens in that, and that she can benefit from, an artist's fee or what have you. So, then balancing that, of course, then she's on the board, and we had to figure out some roles of, creating some separations. But at any rate, that she has, from a board point of view, when we do a convening with Columbia University or with the Metropolitan Planning Council, she's sitting at the table with and discussing these issues, but then behind the scenes, we're bringing community in. We're creating an opportunity for her students to have a place to show their work, as well as for her. So these are some of the things that connect the behind the scenes and in front of the scenes. When we had an opportunity to show work for the Chicago Architecture Biennial, then it was really important that bringing a show that had been seen in Venice into our ruin was also tapping into the resident community. So what we did for that was to create a response exhibit. We had been working with 13 young people who live in public housing all over the city of Chicago in what we call the Youth Advisory Council. So they were participants in driving the museum, what the stories we wanted to tell, but we were also mentoring them. And some of the things they did a unit over one summer where they ended by creating a documentary that addressed violence in their community. They decided who they wanted from their communities to interview. They created questions. They shot it. They created some reels. In other opportunities, we took them on cultural exchange tours to different cities and locations. So this is Detroit, and they experienced and got ideas about this museum that we were trying to make with them from these experiences of going to museums, to cultural institutions, to sites like in Detroit of abandoned communities, distressed communities that they could respond to and see the differences and similarities. We also gave them opportunities to share their own stories and to become experts and to sort of own, we called it owning their stories. So this is a few years ago when the American Institute of Architects was in town. We invited the architects to do tours of public housing, but in this case, Salandria was then a docent telling her story and telling to this audience why for her this was important. So part of the story I want to tell is that these things don't come automatically. So had we had this opportunity to engage a resident community in curating a response to house housing, an exhibit created at an Ivy League university and shown at a business biennale, and had that come and I said, oh, we need to have residents respond without any, this process of working with these youth were something I did starting in 2013 in the summer, and the summer of 2014, the summer of 2015, we started working with them on this project. So understanding what the kids where they were coming from, hearing their stories first, addressing their communities. We actually never specifically talked about issues of public housing or lessons or a curriculum public housing. We used house housing as that curriculum, but also my first job actually was a teacher. Actually, this is a long time ago, 20 years ago. But one of the things I learned about being a teacher, and now there's a formalization of this and the theories of Paulo Freire, a Brazilian. I think I mentioned him in an earlier lecture. But to treat the student as a teacher, as much as the teacher is a teacher, is something that I really respond to. So I think it required us, and I think outreach is the same thing. You don't jump into outreach forcing, an agenda down people's throats and saying, we want you to help us with this. So by the time 2015 rolled around, the students were really eager to learn about public housing in a way that they didn't know, because they don't know the architectural history and they don't know about Jane Addams and Harold Ickes. So it really became an exchange where we asked them to remember their spaces and where they lived, to draw on their ideas of museums. So they wanted a museum that was very interactive, and this is an exhibit, to introduce them to some creative processes like drawing and collaging that they hadn't ever done before. So this was a kind of school, but it didn't feel like school in the worst way, where school feels very didactic and one-sided. It felt really like an exchange where we were asking them to contribute and share, and in the process they were learning some new skills and new ideas. And you can see then that all came together in an exhibit that pieces of it were selected and designed by the professionals, like the furniture, but the young people, all the content on these screens was theirs. They selected it, they edited it, they loaded onto these little video monitors. They wrote the questions, they gathered the questions. From time to time, Shakira, every weekend, was a docent answering people's questions, giving a brief presentation about how they created this, why this was important. And then this exhibit was truly in dialogue with the kind of major exhibit. So this is the room that the youth exhibit is. The rest of the space is this Chicago Architecture Biennial exhibit. Their project was prominently, house housing is from Columbia. We Next Doors are young people responding to it. So it really had a parody. Some of the work that they did earlier on from 2013, then I included in the exhibit I curated to give people a view of this exhibition, this brief opportunity in 2015 to share and open this ruin to the public actually has a long history, a history of the residents who saved these places. This is DeVera Beverly's chair. She passed away, but our founder donated a major object, a history of the real estate development, and then a history of our own work with young people telling their own stories. And so there's audio in the room. So it all came together quite nicely. A front of the house exhibit, but with a lot of back of house kind of interaction. So I'm going to close just with some inspirations for me as I left the project in good hands, that having a community at the table was a really important idea. And so Annie being on the board, but in this case, this was a Future of Public Housing Symposium with national attendance. We had someone from the New York City Housing Authority give a keynote, and scholars from Columbia University and from University of Illinois Chicago give other addresses. But then the responses came from a round table. Everyone at the table had a say. So this is actually Cassie, who authored the reading, sitting next to Annie. They actually know each other because they do work together. So it really becomes like we're all around the table working on something together. The social impact question, the future of public housing. But it's really important to have this going on behind the scenes. It's also important to have this going on behind the scenes. So one of the questions I left the museum with was, through a project like the Biennial, we got traction, attention, leverage, fundraising's going well. This project can happen. The building is now in great disrepair. So as we, through the residents' eyes and through their voice, as we consider who gets hired, who is the talent, who has the design, who designs, who is the exhibit designer, there aren't African-American exhibit designers or architects in great numbers anyway, and certainly not those from public housing. So how can we take our youth group or take the members of this community that are getting retrained in photography, and how to, as the museum addresses this condition of bringing something that's been so long neglected, how does it create opportunities for mentoring, for apprenticeship, for training, so that the work of making the museum for the public and engages deeply and richly and thoroughly the community for whom that change will be important in the process of making the change, if that's clear. So, and that thread really runs through all sorts of programming. So I guess the inspiration I leave with you is thinking about museum programs spatially, temporally, inside and outside the walls. And it's not just exhibits. It's opportunities like we did a Greening Day, where the residents of Little Italy, who had, at one time lived in public housing, now see public housing as this negative thing, are eager to have this building go or become something, or eager for real estate development, sit and garden with their neighbors who they may not have any other opportunity to be in a kind of harmonious and communal and civic environment, which isn't, a community meeting where people are yelling at each other, or setting up a table for a festival day where we learn stories like this guy. I had no idea that all these years the building was boarded up. At the beginning, say in 2002, 2003, squatters were occupying these buildings. So the public housing residents moved out, but homeless people saw these as opportunities. And he had great stories to tell and was really interested in the material he had to share. Here's Crystal leading a workshop, which would have been sparsely attended. We did a workshop the year before, but after we did this exhibit and after all this outreach, hugely attended workshop, storytelling circles where we heard some ethnic European tell stories of public housing, but really people that are still living in public housing took the floor, took the lead, set the tone. We called this Telling Belongings, a community storytelling event. And this was hosted at the community center, which will be down the street from the museum, a community center for public housing residents, which White and Little Italy and academic neighbors, there's a university nearby, rarely go, and it was great to bring people there. So that's it for today. I look forward to seeing your proposals and wrapping up with some final thoughts and responses next week. I forgot to point this back. Okay, good luck. See you soon.